"Who do you guys think is the strongest in the class, Ribbit?" So you would say, she would turn to the rest of their classmates and ask a question that would immediately spark a crazy debate. Everybody would start talking about who they think is the strongest, with some people saying it's Deku, some saying it's Todoroki, and the class would ultimately not come to a consensus. Some people would say that because Todoroki has fire and ice, Deku's water quirk wouldn't be able to stand up to him. But other people are saying that Deku's water quirk seems extremely powerful, and that one good shot to Todoroki should be able to beat him. But ultimately, they would finally end up making their way to the USJ, and once they would end up entering inside, they would be greeted to the world's most boring, unskippable cutscene. Pro Hero 13. She would immediately start telling the class everything that they need to know in regards to quirk safety, and after she would be done yapping for about how long would her speech realistically be? I could see it being like a 10-minute unskippable cutscene, when finally we would get Kurogiri appearing in the center of the USJ and telling the heroes that his feelings are, they're very hurt, considering the fact that they didn't even invite the villains. Like, how rude of them. But anyways, he would then quickly proceed to teleport everybody to different sections. And unfortunately for Kurogiri, he would have chose the worst possible section to send Izuku to, because the second that Izuku would be sent there, Izuku would land in the water, and it's like bro would have the most devious smile. Deku looking around and seeing that there was a bunch of water quirk users or like mutant quirks or things of that nature would just lock in. This man proceeds to squad wipe every single villain in the water section in like 3 seconds, followed by him making his way on top of the boat by using the water underneath him to essentially like move him. He's using the water like microbots, if you guys have seen Big Hero 6. That's what he's doing with it. And he would tell Tsuyu and Mineta to just make their way back towards the shore, that he's going to be helping Aizawa out. So Izuku would quickly lunge towards that direction, as Izuku, holding one hand into the air, would cause 12 different water typhoon looking things to go flying towards the direction of villains, as all of them would be knocked out immediately, which would be incredibly easy considering they couldn't even defend themselves with their quirks thanks to Aizawa, and the ones that were mutants couldn't exactly do anything about it. So after this would happen, you would pretty much just get Shigaraki saying, "Kurogiri, the Nomu," as the Nomu would be brought out, and Izuku would stare at this gigantic behemoth with a brain on the top of its head, wondering what the heck that thing's there for, as the Nomu would quickly go to rush towards the direction of Aizawa, as he would take him out considering that he was eliminating people's quirks. It would go on to punch towards the direction of Aizawa, but Deku, seeing this happen, would cause water to pretty much end up being between Aizawa and the Nomu, which shockingly would not stop the Nomu. The Nomu would punch right through it, and it would hit Aizawa, sending him crashing away, as Aizawa would roll on the floor, and the Nomu would turn towards the direction of Deku, recognizing that he's the one who used that quirk. The Nomu lunging towards the direction of Deku would cause Deku to quickly try to create a shield in front of him, as the Nomu would punch it and straight up destroy the shield. The water would just sputter everywhere, with Deku being shocked, thinking that he used everything he could have possibly done to enforce that shield. Mind you, that shield is not weak, but the Nomu would have shattered it and would have sent Deku flying back, as he would have sent him crashing onto the ground, but Izuku would have ended up softening his fall by using water. It'd be at this point that the Nomu would come crashing towards him again, but a bunch of water would go and surround the Nomu. The Nomu would now have a bunch of water restraining him and holding both of his arms back, as the Nomu would let out a screech and rip one of its arms off before it rips the other one out and screeches in Deku's face. Deku, realizing that this that this Nomu is like a big freaking deal, would pretty much proceed to use his water to shoot a gigantic pressurized beam at the Nomu, which would be the highest amount of pressure he could actually use, which would leave a hole, not a hole that would go all the way through the Nomu, but one that would go like halfway through, piercing into the Nomu, but then it would just regenerate. This would shock Izuku, who's absolutely stunned at the fact that the freaking Nomu could do something like this. This would lead Izuku to for one of the first times in the series, to actually cower. This dude proceeds to hold his hands up in his face, realizing that this thing was 100% about to beat on him, when suddenly Bakugo would come flying in using his explosion quirk, saying, "Get out of the way, extra!" as he would blast an explosion into the Nomu's face, causing the Nomu to turn towards him and punch him. But before the punch could connect, a beam of ice would appear and Todoroki would be there. Now we would suddenly have explosions, Todoroki, and Izuku staring at the Nomu, and all three of them would wonder how the heck they're gonna handle this. So Todoroki would shoot an ice geyser at the Nomu, freezing it in place, as Bakugo would come flying in with an explosion, but the Nomu would break out and go to punch Bakugo, but Deku, using his water quirk, would actually grab onto the Nomu, holding its arm back. The Nomu would screech, looking towards the direction of Izuku, as Bakugo comes in with an explosion square to the face, which does nothing. Literally nothing. At this point, Bakugo would say, "Hold it still, I'm gonna blast its brains off," as we would pretty much get a scene where Todoroki freezes the Nomu, and Deku would use his water to hold its legs and arms back. And as this is happening, we get a moment where Bakugo comes flying in and shoots a point blank gauntlet blast at the Nomu's face, like causing a brain bits to go everywhere, as one of the eyes would even go flying off and the Nomu would fall to the ground. Aizawa at this point would have been using his cancel quirk to stop Aizawa from letting him regenerate, and Kurogiri would teleport Aizawa away. Aizawa, realizing that he can't see the Nomu anymore, would slam his hand on the ground, as the Kurogiri would come in once more, teleporting Todoroki away, who was a huge help, and he would try to teleport Izuku away, but Izuku would narrowly dodge, using his water to change his momentum, not allowing him to fall into the portal. As now, we would pretty much get Izuku and Bakugo staring at this beast that was now in front of them, as they would try to beat the Nomu, but suddenly the Nomu would come flying in and punch Bakugo, as this would shatter his other gauntlet that he had left and send him crashing away, as it would rush towards the direction of Bakugo, and Deku, seeing that Bakugo was about to get hit once more, would go rushing in, as his water would, all the water that was pretty much inside of that that water section, he would use it to cover the Nomu and trap him inside of this gigantic prison. Deku's eyes would start glowing as his hands would be held out, and he would be holding the Nomu back, restraining it perfectly. It'd be at this point that Shigaraki, noticing that this was happening, would rush towards Deku, as he would go to try to decay him, and right as he was about to touch him, you would see the symbol of peace, All Might, crashing in, as he would say, "I am here," and he would end up essentially protecting Deku by getting him out of the way of Shigaraki and putting Izuku behind him, saying his iconic "I am here" line. This would lead Shigaraki to being stunned that All Might was finally here, as Kurogiri, seeing this, would tell Kurogiri to get the brats out of the way, as a portal would open underneath Deku's legs and it would teleport him away where Todoroki was sent to. Bakugo, seeing this, would go rushing in once more, having recovered a bit from the last punch he took from the Nomu, and would actually try to hit Shigaraki, but a portal would open, causing him to dodge out of the way, and the hand would be just about to grab onto Bakugo's face when All Might would come flying in, and he would pretty much grab a Shigaraki's arm, stopping him, but the Nomu would then come flying in and punch him right on his weak spot, sending All Might crashing back, as All Might and the Nomu would get into a heated one-on-one battle, which All Might would win obviously, but it would take him a lot. After this would happen, All Might would still end up pretty much faking that he's still able to remain in his large human form, which would ultimately lead to Shigaraki escaping just like he would in the original, and the students having their usual cleanup that they get in the original. Following this, Deku would have a couple of things put into perspective. His quirk is incredibly powerful. I mean, we've seen this dude be able to take out a zero-pointer. But against something like the Nomu, where Deku had to be just as focused on defense as he had to be on offense, Izuku just didn't have the battle experience to handle something like the Nomu, and this would severely hit Deku, realizing that he needs to get a lot stronger and faster. So over the course of their 1 or 2 week break, I'm not really sure what it is, let's say 2 weeks just for a more realistic training arc, Deku is essentially going to be spending a week training on his own, grinding at the gym, and trying to learn new techniques. And funny enough, a form that Deku uses to train is to essentially look up fictional characters with water capabilities and try to see if Deku has access to doing certain techniques and moves and powers that they actually use. But Deku, not having anybody to actually practice this stuff against, would realize that he's actually going to be needing a little bit of help. So as much as Deku hates to admit it, he would end up going to Bakugo's house, where he would ring on the doorbell only to be greeted by Kachan, who'd say, "Huh? "The hell are you doing here, Deku?" As from here, Izuku turning towards Bakugo would say, "Bakugo, I need your help training." As Bakugo would slam the door in his face and Deku would say, "You can hurl explosions at me all you want and get more powerful yourself." Bakugo from this point would open the door and say, "I'm listening, Deku, but if we do this my way." From here, for the next week, Deku and Bakugo would train together. Mind you, they still don't like each other, but they both have to admit the fact that training together definitely does help them out. And because they're quote-unquote rivals, not really because it's a one-sided rivalry, Deku would pretty much focus mostly on defense, making sure that something like the Nomu where he's scared and he's cowering never happens again. And also, he would work on these really insanely overpowered instant kill moves. He would work on this by using a mannequin. Now, what he would end up doing to the mannequin is carving out the inside of the mannequin. He would get a mannequin, cut it in half, carve out the inside, and essentially use a move that he saw on an anime he watched, where a water user shoved so much water into their target that they just exploded from the inside out. And that's a move that Deku would work on. Now, obviously, he's not going to use that on humans. At least he doesn't think he will. But if he ever encounters something like the Nomu that's a monster or a creature like that, he could use it on it. Deku would also work on techniques like a water dragon by the ocean, something that he had never thought of before for some reason, realizing that he was not really thinking outside of the box, working on a far more powerful water prison, and also working on water clones, a technique that pretty much allows him to create a bunch of duplicates of himself, which are able to manipulate water themselves or simply blow up with a force that is actually extremely shocking. Like, if it blows up in your face, it's going to stun you. It's not going to kill you, but it's going to stun you really harshly, and that's the objective of those clones. Deku would have gotten a lot stronger during this time skip, and his defenses would have shot up through the roof having worked with Bakugo, somebody who definitely would have used this opportunity to blow a couple of explosions in his face. That said, after the 2 weeks of training would finally be over, Izuku would make his way back to school where all of the students would be informed of the UA Sports Festival. And after this would happen, we were pretty much just going to be skipping straight to that, with Deku being the one who gives the speech, but that doesn't really matter, right? So we're going to be skipping immediately into the actual events of this, and we would zoom in on midnight, essentially shooting a starter's pistol as everybody would go and Todoroki would freeze the ground, causing a bunch of the contestants to actually be frozen to the ground, but Izuku would definitely not be one of them. Izuku would end up rushing towards the direction of the zero pointers, and as he's running towards them, Izuku would let out an X-shaped slash towards the direction of one of them, which would cause the zero pointer to be cut in half by water that has so much pressure behind it that it literally cut the zero pointer in half, something that he wasn't able to do before, as he would use a black whip like ability with water to swing past the zero pointers and get right by them. He would be on the tail of Bakugo, who would be using his explosions to blast first place and rushing as fast as he can to the finish line. Deku, seeing that Bakugo was getting ahead of him, would run as with two fingers aimed at Bakugo's direction, which he would have stole from Suigetsu from Naruto, having watched it. He would shoot his water pistols at the direction of Bakugo, causing Bakugo to have to dodge out of the way as he's rushing towards the finish line, and Todoroki, seeing that both of them are definitely fighting for that, would slide through with his ice. He would freeze the ground, thinking that was gonna harm Deku some way somehow. But Deku would simply create a black whip tendril, grabbing onto Todoroki's ice as he would use it to his own advantage and swing on it, making his way closer and closer towards the direction of Bakugo, who was currently in first place, as he would swing and shoot water pistol bullets. But ultimately, Bakugo would end up getting first place, having improved a lot during his training with Deku, and Todoroki would end up getting second place, as Izuku would have came in on third, never having relied on his bomb strategy that he would have used in the original. That said, Deku would not have the same thing that happened to him in the original where nobody wanted to be teammates with him. Instead, that would be Bakugo. Unlike Deku, would still be able to recruit his team just like he was in the original. Izuku, however, his team would be a little bit different, because in this specific timeline, he's not going to be having Mei Hatsume on his team, because she does not want to be on his team considering he's not in first, and Bakugo's not going to be letting her be on his team, so she'd probably be in Todoroki's team. Deku, however, is probably still going to be having Tokiyami and Uraraka, and just for the heck of it, I say we throw Ida in there because he's friends with Uraraka, so that's the team that they're going to be having. But what they wouldn't be expecting is that the people who are actually going to hold them up would be a bunch of clones of Izuku, as Izuku would use his water techniques to essentially get them past this section of the story without getting eliminated. Now, mind you, some of you guys might have noticed that I didn't exactly cover this section, and that's just due to the fact that I hate the cavalry battle. It's so annoying and tedious to cover, so let's skip that and get right into Shinso versus Deku. Now, this is kind of a little bit of an interesting section of the story just because I'm not entirely sure what direction of the story I should take this in. Should Deku speak to Shinso, he's gonna lose, and there's nothing that's gonna be able to snap him out of it. Mind you, he doesn't have one for all. But then there's a part of me that believes that Deku probably wouldn't answer him, and the reason for that is just because of the personality that this Deku has built up through the story that he's been on. So I'm just going to be saying that for this specific timeline, so that nothing ends too soon, Deku's going to be getting past Shinso. And after this would happen, unlike in the original, we're never going to get that section where Todoroki and Deku would have their own little moment before their own battle. Just because of the fact that this time Deku doesn't have a quirk similar to All Might, so Todoroki can't exactly connect the dots, if you get what I mean. But that being the case, we would now get a battle between Todoroki and Izuku, and this would be explosive, because unlike in the original, Deku doesn't have access to One for All to just shatter the ice, but he could still counter Todoroki, and he would do so by using his water and pressurizing it so much that it could just shatter the ice. So Todoroki would do his best to use his ice to essentially defeat Deku, but because Deku's control with his water and the pressure and the damage output that he could use with it now, it's just insane. So this would pretty much end up leading Todoroki's ice to actually helping Izuku, because this time Deku's water would actually be able to thaw out some of the ice, so Todoroki would unintentionally actually be giving Deku even more water that he could use that isn't his own. And so, Deku would essentially end up using so much water that Todoroki just couldn't even keep up with it. Ultimately, it would lead to a point where Todoroki just gets overwhelmed by Izuku's abilities, and he would be sent crashing out of the arena with water just like covering him. The dude's hair would be all wet, and Todoroki could have like maybe tried to use his flames, but guess what happens to fire when it comes into contact with water? Yeah, it gets snuffed out. So, yeah. That pretty much happens, and after some smoke would end up dissipating, it would be revealed that Todoroki was laying on his butt on the arena, or not on the arena, but outside of the arena. So, Deku would move forward, and we would get a battle between Deku and Bakugo. And this one is actually going to be a little bit interesting, because now Bakugo has a bit of understanding onto how Izuku's quirk works. So Bakugo understands that getting into close range battle with Izuku is probably his worst nightmare, but getting into a long range combat is a death sentence, because of the fact that if he gets into long range combat, that's practically Izuku's specialty. So what Bakugo would decide to do is to start the battle by feinting like he's gonna get into close range combat and blasting towards him before then shooting up into the air and shooting a smoke bomb, redirecting behind Izuku, as Izuku would create a water barrier around him, to which Bakugo would use his explosion trying to blow it up, but realizing that he can't, he would be stunned to see that the water barrier would shoot water at him like water spikes. Bakugo in this moment would dodge out of the way, dodging most of them, but some of them would actually make contact, as Deku, using a water whip, would grab onto Bakugo's leg, dragging him down, as Bakugo would be sent crashing into the stadium. From here, Bakugo would crack his neck, saying, "What do you say we go hand to hand?" And Deku would say, "Fine by me," as he would rush in and both of them would go to throw a punch. Bakugo with one with an explosion, and Deku would have a giant water arm that would connect with Bakugo, which would actually cause the explosion to blow the arm up, as Deku, all he needed really was to get close to Bakugo. Water would begin surrounding Bakugo's leg, as Bakugo in this moment would aim his hands down to blow that up, causing his defenses to be completely dropped, as Deku in that moment would say checkmate, holding a water pistol to the head of Bakugo, saying give up, as Bakugo would say that's not my style, and Deku would say I know, shooting that thing right at the head of Bakugo, as Bakugo would fall down onto the ground acting like he was unconscious. But in a last split second, Bakugo would turn towards Deku, as you know, he was faking the fall and like he was actually knocked out, as he would shoot an explosion point blank towards the direction of Deku, sending him crashing to the ground, as Deku would be stunned that Bakugo managed to pull that off. Deku in this moment would use his water to grab onto Bakugo, surrounding him completely, as Bakugo now was in a completely really unadvantageous situation, and he pretty much had to give up. The dude had no choice. So Deku ends up winning the entire sports festival with his extremely versatile water quirk, and he would be awarded the first place medal. As now, we're going to be jumping into the Stain arc. But ladies and gentlemen, before we do that, you guys are going to be having to smash 300 likes. So after you guys do that, I'm going to be dropping the next part. But with that being said, it has been your boy Xehther, and I am out. Peace.